In the early spring of 1945, the heart of the Third Reich was no longer a fortress, it was a wound. General George S. Patton's Third Army was screaming across the German countryside with a speed that defied military logic, turning the once mighty Wehrmacht into a collection of scattered, desperate pockets of resistance. But as the sun began to set over a strategic town guarding a vital bridgehead toward the Rhine, Patton's momentum hit a wall of stone and iron. This was the opening of a confrontation that would soon become a legend of the war, a chapter we call the Fortress in the Path. The town was not large, but its geography was a nightmare for an attacking force. Situated on high ground, its ancient stone buildings and narrow streets had been transformed into a series of interlocking machine gun nests and sniper perches. At the center of this defense sat a medieval-style administrative building, its thick walls capable of absorbing tank fire like a sponge. This wasn't just a town anymore, it was a cork in a bottle. If Patton couldn't pull it out, his entire armored column, miles of tanks, fuel trucks, and infantry would be sitting ducks for German long-range artillery. The man holding the cork was a German major, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had survived the horrors of Stalingrad. He wasn't a fanatic SS officer, but he was a professional soldier of the old school, driven by a rigid sense of duty and a refusal to accept that the war was already lost. He had roughly 400 men under his command, a mix of hardened veterans and terrified teenagers from the Volkssturm. To the major, the town was his last stand, a place to earn a final bit of glory for a dying regime. He had ordered the streets mined and the basements reinforced, telling his men that the Americans are soft, they rely on their machines, but they cannot face a determined heart. From a nearby ridge, Patton watched the town through his binoculars. He could see the white sheets of surrender hanging from a few civilian windows, but he also saw the telltale flashes of snipers and the camouflaged barrels of 88mm guns poking through the rubble. To Patton, time was more precious than ammunition. Every hour he spent sieging this town was an hour the Germans could use to blow the bridges over the Rhine. Patton's aides suggested a standard infantry assault, a slow and bloody process of clearing house by house. But Patton had a different idea. He still held on to a fragment of old-world military courtesy. He decided to give the major a choice. He wouldn't just send in the tanks, he would send a messenger. It was a gesture of respect from one professional to another, an offer of an honorable surrender that would save the town from total destruction and spare the lives of the soldiers inside. As the American lieutenant carrying a white flag began the long, lonely walk toward the German lines, the guns fell silent. The men of the Third Army watched from their foxholes, and the German defenders watched from their ruins. The stage was set for a diplomatic ultimatum. But inside that stone fortress, the German major was preparing a response that would ignite Patton's legendary temper and turn this strategic town into a furnace of American fire. The fortress in the path was about to face the full, unbridled wrath of old blood and guts.
The morning mist hung heavy over the valley as the American messenger, a young lieutenant with a white flag gripped tightly in his hand, crossed the no-man's land toward the German-held town. Behind him, the engines of Patton's Third Army idled with a low, predatory growl. On the ridge, General Patton himself stood by his jeep, his eyes fixed on the town. This was the diplomatic ultimatum, a moment of cold, professional tension before the inevitable storm. The lieutenant was met at the edge of the rubble by two German sentries, their faces hollow from weeks of retreat. They led him through the winding, debris-strewn streets to the central administrative building. Inside, the air smelled of damp stone and stale tobacco. Standing in the center of a room lit only by a few flickering candles was the German major. He was impeccably dressed despite the circumstances, his iron cross hanging from his neck, his posture as rigid as the stone walls surrounding him. The American lieutenant delivered the message clearly. General Patton was offering a formal, honorable surrender. If the major laid down his arms, his men would be treated as prisoners of war with full military honors, and the town, along with the civilians hiding in its cellars, would be spared from a full-scale bombardment. It was a fair offer, a soldier's deal, designed to stop the senseless killing in a war that was already strategically over. But the major did not see it that way. To him, the offer was not a gesture of mercy, it was a sign of American weakness. He looked at the young lieutenant with a thin, mocking smile. He had spent years on the Eastern Front, where surrender was often a death sentence. He believed that the Americans were amateurs who were too afraid to fight for every inch of ground. "Tell your general," the major said, his voice cold and echoing in the hall, "that a German officer does not surrender to a mob of shopkeepers and cowboys. If General Patton wants this town, he will have to pay for it with the blood of his men. We have enough ammunition to turn this street into a graveyard for your tanks. My answer is no." The lieutenant tried to speak, to warn him of the sheer amount of artillery currently aimed at his position, but the major simply turned his back. The parley was over. When the lieutenant returned to the American lines and delivered the major's response, the atmosphere changed instantly. Patton's face didn't just turn red, it turned a dark, dangerous purple. He had offered the olive branch, and it had been slapped out of his hand. To Patton, this wasn't just a military refusal, it was a personal insult to the American soldier. "He called us shopkeepers," Patton roared, his hand instinctively dropping to the ivory grip of his revolver. "He wants to die for his Führer? Fine, we'll give him exactly what he asked for. If he wants to turn this town into a graveyard, make sure he's the first one buried in it." Patton turned to his artillery commander with a look of terrifying clarity. There would be no more messengers, no more white flags. The major had mistaken Patton's civility for a lack of resolve, and now he was about to learn that the cowboys he mocked had brought a hurricane with them. The diplomatic window had slammed shut, and in its place, the iron rain was about to fall.
The rejection from the German major didn't just frustrate General Patton, it insulted his very sense of reality. When the lieutenant returned with the news that the major had mocked the American army as a mob of shopkeepers, Patton didn't pace or deliberate. He stood perfectly still, a terrifying calm settling over his features. He reached out, took the map from his aide's hand, and drew a thick, jagged circle around the administrative building where the major was hiding. This was the moment of the great pivot, the transition from the diplomat to the destroyer. This was, "Then die where you stand." Patton turned to his corps commanders, his voice rising in that high-pitched, crackling tone that always signaled a coming storm. "He thinks we are afraid to bleed? He thinks his stone walls can protect him from the 20th century? Patton slammed his fist onto the hood of his Jeep. "If that major wants to be a martyr for a dead corporal in Berlin, I will be happy to oblige him. I want that building hit with everything we've got. I don't want a stone left standing on top of another. If he won't come out to surrender, then let him stay there, under 10 feet of rubble." The orders that followed were a masterclass in overwhelming force. Patton didn't just order a standard barrage, he ordered a time-on-target strike, one of the most devastating tactics in the American arsenal.
In a TOT mission, every battery from every artillery unit in the sector, ranging from the light 105mm howitzers to the massive 8-inch long toms, calculates the flight time of their shells so that they all impact the exact same spot at the exact same second. "I want the first round to be his last thought," Patton growled. He was no longer interested in the town as a strategic objective. He was interested in the town as a lesson. He wanted every German officer across the remaining front to hear the roar of what happened when you refused the Third Army's mercy. He was sending a message. Patton's honor was a gift, and once rejected, it was replaced by an industrial-scale execution. Down in the town, the German major was likely checking his watch, expecting a cautious infantry probe, or perhaps a few tanks to test his perimeter. He likely thought he had hours, perhaps even days, to play his game of defiant resistance. He didn't understand that he was no longer fighting a man. He was fighting a machine that had been provoked by a legend. Patton stood on the ridgeline, looking at his watch. His ivory-handled pistols caught the afternoon light, looking like bone against the dark leather of his belt. He wasn't looking for a fight anymore. He was looking for a reckoning. To the men around him, the general looked like a vengeful god of the Old Testament. He had given the major the chance to live as a professional. Now he was forcing him to die as a fool. "Fire," Patton said, the word barely a whisper. In that instant, the horizon behind the American lines turned into a solid wall of orange flame. Hundreds of guns spoke at once, a thunder that shook the very earth beneath the tanks. The air began to whistle with the sound of thousands of pounds of steel screaming through the sky toward a single coordinate. The major had asked for blood and iron. Patton was about to deliver it in a volume that the world had never seen before. The major's fortress was no longer a stronghold. It was a target, and the time of talking had ended in a roar of American steel.
For those huddled in the cellars of the German town, the world didn't just end, it dissolved. At exactly the moment Patton's watch hit the mark, the Iron Rain began. It wasn't a series of individual explosions. It was a continuous, earth-shattering roar that felt like the atmosphere itself was being torn apart. This was 45 minutes of hell, a calculated display of industrial-age fury that turned a fortified stronghold into a smoking crater in the earth. The time-on-target strike landed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel and the weight of a falling mountain. In the first 3 seconds, over 100 heavy shells impacted the central administrative building simultaneously. The major, who just minutes before had been standing with arrogant posture, was likely thrown across the room before he even heard the sound. The thick stone walls, which he had bragged could withstand the American cowboys, didn't just crack, they turned into shrapnel. Granite blocks the size of pianos were tossed into the air like autumn leaves. Patton watched from the ridge, his silhouette framed by the flickering orange light of the horizon. He didn't look away. To him, this wasn't cruelty. It was the inevitable mathematics of war. For every minute the major refused to surrender, more of Patton's boys were at risk. Therefore, Patton would spend 10,000 shells to save one American life. The sky over the town turned a sickly shade of gray and black, choked with the dust of pulverized brick and the sulfurous smoke of high explosives. The bombardment was systematic. After the initial shock, the American batteries shifted into a rhythmic pounding. They targeted the escape routes, the sniper nests in the church towers, and the basement entrances. The sound was so intense that American soldiers miles away felt their teeth ache and their ears bleed. Inside the town, the German defenders realized the terrifying truth. They weren't in a battle, they were in a slaughterhouse. The major's determined hearts were no match for 15 5mm howitzers that could drop a shell through a chimney from 5 miles away. As the 45-minute mark approached, Patton ordered the final stunk, a concentrated burst of white phosphorus shells. The town was suddenly engulfed in a terrifying, beautiful white light. Phosphorus rained down like burning snow, sticking to everything it touched, creating a chemical fire that could not be extinguished. It was the final psychological blow. The defiance of the German garrison vanished. The soldiers who had sworn to fight to the last breath were now scrambling through the rubble, blinded by smoke and deafened by the percussion, their only thought being to find a way to stop the noise. When the guns finally went silent, the silence was more terrifying than the roar. A massive mushroom-shaped cloud of dust hung over the town, obscuring the sun. The fortress in the path was gone. In its place was a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Patton lowered his binoculars and climbed into his jeep. "Now," he said to his tank commanders, "go see if the major has changed his mind about the shopkeepers." The iron rain had done its work. It had shredded the major's arrogance and buried his defiance under 1,000,000 tons of debris. Patton had promised that if the major wouldn't come out to surrender, he would stay there forever. As the American tanks began to move toward the smoking ruins, they weren't expecting a fight. They were going to collect the survivors of a man who had made the mistake of thinking George S. Patton was a man of empty words.
The dust had not yet settled when the first American Sherman tanks clattered into the town square, their treads grinding over pulverized brick and the twisted remains of German anti-tank guns. The silence that followed the bombardment was heavy, broken only by the crackle of burning timber and the occasional collapse of a weakened wall. This was the reckoning in the rubble, the final cold meeting between the man who had offered mercy and the man who had been arrogant enough to refuse it. American infantrymen moved through the ruins with their rifles leveled, but there was no one left to fight. The German soldiers they encountered were no longer the defiant warriors of the morning. They were hollow-eyed ghosts, covered in white stone dust, their hands trembling as they reached for the sky. They didn't look for their officers. They looked for the nearest American medic or a crust of bread. The fortress had been turned into a tomb of gray ash. A squad of combat engineers reached the site of the Central Administrative Building. It was unrecognizable. What had been a proud 3-story stone monument to German authority was now a jagged mound of rubble. It took 20 minutes of digging and prying at the debris before they found a way into the reinforced cellar. There, huddled in the dark and choked by the smell of cordite, was the German major. He was no longer the impeccable officer who had mocked the shopkeepers. His tunic was torn, his iron cross was lost in the dirt, and a thin trickle of blood ran from his ear, a result of the concussive force of the time-on-target strike. When he was pulled out into the blinding afternoon sun, he blinked like an owl, staggering as he was led toward a waiting jeep. General Patton was waiting at the edge of the town. He did not get out of his vehicle. He sat in the passenger seat, his polished helmet gleaming and his ivory-handled pistols catching the light. He watched as the major was brought before him. In the traditional old-world military code, a captured officer of high rank was often treated with a certain level of professional courtesy, a salute, a seat at a table, perhaps even a glass of wine. But Patton offered none of it. He looked at the major with a gaze that was as cold as the steel of his tanks. The major tried to stand straight, tried to regain some fragment of his shattered dignity. He began to speak, perhaps to offer a formal surrender or to complain about the excessive use of fire. Patton cut him off with a single sharp gesture of his hand. "You had your chance to be a soldier.
Patton said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the thousands of shells he had just unleashed. "You chose to be a fool. You called my men cowards, and now you stand in the ruins of your own arrogance. You didn't just lose this town, Major. You murdered your own men for the sake of a lie." Patton turned his head, refusing to even look at the man any longer. He gave a short, dismissive nod to the MPs. "Take him to the rear with the rest of the prisoners. Don't give him a chair, and don't give him a salute. He's earned nothing but the dirt he's standing on." As the major was led away, stumbling over the very ruins he had sworn to defend, Patton signaled for his column to move out. The fortress in the path was gone. The road to the Rhine was open. The reckoning was complete. Patton had shown the world that his mercy had a price, and that those who refused it would find themselves buried under the weight of an army that didn't just fight for ground, but for the total destruction of those who dared to stand in the way of freedom.